Introduction, and to everyone for having us. We certainly wish we were there in person, but the world has its advantages. Antonio is actually joining us from Croatia, and I'm out in Los Angeles, and we're going to close out the day, I think, with the theme actually of the day, which is everything that people have been presenting today has been created by effort, intellect, passion, the ability to focus on something that we want, and then the ability as educators to impart what it is that you all are creating, and also, as we saw in many of the presentations today, impact the work of practitioners. And we titled our talk "The Sage on the Stage to the Fellow Human on the Stage of Life," because at a time when society is questioning sort of what is the role of leaders, what is the role of people in positions of authority, in one way it challenges the position of these individuals, but it's also, in our opinion, a real opportunity. And we're gathered at this conference to push forward, as to the mission of the organization, which is to help the cause of progress and prosperity in society through research and managerial excellence. And for research and managerial excellence to occur, the individuals who are partaking in that activity need to be as healthy as possible. And the pandemic has been a huge stressor. We know from the World Health Organization, also from the Center for Disease Control in the US, that mental health deterioration is now a leading cause of risk for individuals. We certainly see it in our children. And we're going to spend about 15 minutes trying to think about how we can bring hope to the new generation, without whom really we have no hope. So in one way, what has happened is very traumatic. On the other hand, it also gives an opportunity to people like you and the practitioners that you impact to come down from their stage, to sort of, instead of being a beacon that is flashing into the night, that they can also be a beacon of hope. Before we get there, there is an opportunity to talk about mental health differently because the young generation are willing to do so, but they're also particularly at risk at the moment.
Beautiful point, Carin. The younger generations are supposed to be the leaders of the future. They are going to make a difference in the world, and they're particularly struggling. The reality of the work younger generations are experiencing has been changing for quite some time now. It is the element of digital transformation that is reaching us as well. Both Carin and I witnessed this with our interactions with students in classrooms, in boardrooms. And what's interesting is the focus of their efforts is on the development of personal branding. This is something they've been advised to focus on. Emphasize their strengths, go into the ideals, focus on the idealization of the world they live in and how they want to be perceived. At the same time, these people are exposed to human brands, but we feel that they focus on the strengths of these human brands, when in fact the reality that makes human brands so influential from our research findings suggests that it's the reality or the understanding of their vulnerabilities, because this makes their stories more relatable. They make them more human, and in a way showcases that there is a lot of strength in showcasing vulnerabilities. We can learn a lot from failure stories all throughout organizational changes, since we know for a fact that there's a high, an alarmingly high rate of organizational change failures. So there's a lot of behavior oriented towards seeking validation online, seeking affirmation as well. It creates a toxic culture that often fosters a lot of loneliness. And it's a community that focuses on ideals, closing the opportunity to talk about something that's common to all of us, and that's how we face adversity, how we overcome it, and what we can learn from it. The younger generation finds a lot of solace in substances and consumption, the retail therapy, as we know, the e-commerce therapy, or what's even more alarming, the online dating world, where human beings are perceived as goods to be consumed or to be very, I would say, easily dismissible. So there's a lot of seeking for certain lightness within the darkness or the ambiguity, the reality that is obviously unknown. And there's a big role that teachers can play here. Educators overall being the illuminators that can help alleviate some of these challenges and stresses. And this is actually what we want to talk about and what we want to emphasize here. That's the reality of changing these ideals. So educators have often been put on pedestals, professors in particular, being the heroes of knowledge world, the people who know it all, who seem to have it all under control, got a lot of exposure in media, doing a lot of talks. And our recent research actually suggests that more influential stories come from people who are not being portrayed as heroes, but who are being portrayed as individuals who are able to overcome all of the adversities. We have here on the visual two graphical representations of narrative storylines. The red one is the more, we would say, realistic one, where people overcome adversity, where sentiment of stories changes. And this is the narrative that is deemed more engaging by audiences. We've seen this all across different media. We've seen it in organizational change as well. And this is what makes human brands more influential. It's talking about overcoming adversity. It's actually mentioned in one of the case studies that Carin wrote with Michael Phelps, and the challenges of overcoming mental illnesses and overall mental adversity when faced with a lot of stress, with a lot of anxiety, and high performance in a highly stressful environment that is the Olympics. And at the same time, we see the positive sentiment, the story that starts with a positive sentiment and predominantly revolve in the positive realm, the so-called hero narrative, which is deemed less engaging and boring, especially to students, which in a certain, to a certain degree, it makes a lot of sense, because if you listen to someone who talks all about the positive things that they were able to do, not mentioning the adversities that they had to overcome, it just sounds like bragging. It's less engaging and definitely less informing. So in terms of talking about how to illuminate, how to be illuminative, there's a big lesson here in showcasing our own humility. As educators, being able to showcase a certain level of vulnerability to enable students to open up and just embrace this dimension of what it means to be a human, and that there is a lot of strength in overcoming adversity. Just as, for example, the most engaging narratives tell stories about characters who had to overcome a lot of adversity. There's a saying, if you want to create a very interesting and intriguing story, break down your character as you write it with as much adversity as possible.
So what happens when you step down from the stage of perfection of a hero narrative and you enable students to see you in a different way, and also for students to share in a different way? It's a very different kind of work. I mean, we see this in management, we see this in academia. And one thing that we want to be doing in learning spaces and in professional spaces is making sure that people's lived experiences and differences and difference of thoughts are coming up, and creating a place where it is okay for people to feel comfortable sharing has been very much written about under the term of psychological safety by Amy Edmondson. And here we explore this notion that if you're coming down the stage and open up and are willing to challenge your students to do the same and come with you, it's important that we become self-aware about the biases that we're bringing in these conversations. So, for example, if I had an experience as a young child of losing two of my uncles, and I might have a very different point of view towards the risk of suicide than somebody else might. So whenever I have a conversation with someone, I really try very hard to think of who am I to this conversation? What do I know? What are the biases that I bring? So there's some discipline that needs to be exercised and some self-reflection. Then there is also consciousness and more mindfulness around how we're going to enable individuals to open up and to take risks with personal, but also with intellectual things. And how do we make sure that the diversity that we have in the classrooms, but also in the workplaces where we now have 5 generations cohabitating, we'll be able to connect with each other in a different way, in a more open and a more human way, but with a great deal of respect about the other person's humanity. One challenge as we open up is that we need to be in a place where the others do not abuse this confidence or do not misuse trust, because once you have this inability to sort of feel confident in trusting somebody else with something that matters to you, then you will lose that trust. The slides distinguish between, pick back up on this theme about a personal brand versus the human brand. And we think that this is a real tension for young people these days who are trying to present a certain way in sort of this Potemkin village of social media. And yet we know from the stats are very, very different. So finding a way to encourage individuals to think about the costs of the games that they're playing to themselves and whether these are really games that they want to play, I think could be a way that educators might also really help the young generation at this difficult time. So a lot have been said about this notion of burnout. What happens in burnout actually starts a little bit with what Antonio called the hero narrative, which is, I must be here for everyone. I must work harder than everybody else because I'm the only one who can do this job. And then after a while, we become cynical. We realize that we cannot change things. And then you see people, the term is burning out, but it has actually 8 stages. And the first stage tends to be when people think that they have so much to do. And so the analogy that we would like to leave you with is that of a candle that, can set a house on fire, but it can also light another candle and really illuminate the darkness. And that in a time when things feel very dark, when we oscillate on these curves that Antonio showed us between sort of thinking that things will be okay and that we can make them okay, to being despondent that nothing can be done, just opening up to a student, opening up to a candle, just being a little bit of light in someone's darkness and encouraging them to do the same can have a huge impact. And I'll leave it to Antonio for our takeaways because we want to make sure that we have time for conversation.
Yeah, very beautifully said, Karen. Pretty much what we would like to encourage you to take away from this session is to consider the mainstream discussion around digital transformation being focused on technology. In fact, is a story about human transformation. We've learned that people transform personally on an individual level as they conduct all of these digital aspects of work. It's important with the world of ChatGPT and the role of teachers and educators in the classroom, where the narrative changes from I know something the others don't, more towards a more serious and more responsible mediator of conversations where others can learn from other perspectives, not necessarily just from a broad body of knowledge, which is increasingly becoming available to the broad population. It's about changing the perspective from a hero and a villain, a narrative, into a mediator or someone who can bring people together and help them feel this this sensation of not being alone. That we all share certain vulnerabilities, we all share certain challenges, and sometimes don't feel the best. We sometimes experience these negatively sentimented chapters of our stories. And at the end of the day, great storytellers, great change leaders, great educators, great illuminators of darkness are people who are able to turn this fear of the unknown into hope. And we want to leave you with that one as perceiving the challenges of both digital transformation and the world we live in today as a challenge of hope, as a method of trying to find ways to bring hope to future leaders, young leaders who are struggling at the moment, experiencing the ambiguity of the world at a higher level than has ever been seen in recent history. And we've got a couple of references here for you. Probably we're gonna be able to distribute the slides for you so that you can take a look at these wonderful cases and a couple of our academic resources. In case someone is more interested in the topic, you can feel free to reach out to both of us with our respective fields. And with that being said, we're open for the questions.
Wonderful presentation and extremely timely. So thank you very much. I think all of us can relate to your presentation. So audience members, at this moment, we're going to open up the floor for Q&A, discussions. And so maybe I'll keep monitoring and we'll see. But right now, I'd just like to start off. I have a question for you. So in your presentation, especially when we think about that third key takeaway that you just had, when as the number of years grows between the educator and the new cohorts that are coming in each year, are there any necessary precursors that you would advise us as educators to continue to look for, such as making sure our listening skills are right, our EQ? Do we have to have the right types of personality traits, such as, you know, leaning more toward introversion or extroversion? Is it important for us to debrief? Like if we encourage vulnerability in the classroom, and if a student has a breakthrough in tearing and so forth, you know, some of us are not, it's not intuitive when we need to do the debrief. And so I was wondering if you could speak to those types of things as some of the audience members get ready to ask a question.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll get started. The first big distinction that I would make is, which applies to managers and teachers, and even to some extent as parents, is that we can support, we can listen, we can find resources, we can provide accommodations as per the ADA and other rules. We can be decent human beings, but it is usually not a good idea to think of ourselves as possibly being other people's therapists. And this is actually a great concern of the two of us who have been sort of interested in mental health issues in the workplace since before it was okay to be having conversations like this one, which is that now suddenly everybody's diagnosing everybody else. And, you know, I think if only professionals can do that. What we can observe are behaviors when people are not showing up on time, or maybe looking different, are late on classes when they shouldn't be. And then to come from a place of empathy, which is, I've noticed that you haven't been as prompt as you used to be in submitting your papers. Is there anything that I can do to help you meet the deadlines the way that I think you want to be meeting them? If a student comes to you with having a death in the family, you know, I think in the Western world, we're extremely quick to say you get 3 bereavement dates, you know, you get 3 days off at work, and then you better do everything you have to do in these 3 days, and then I want you back like that. So empathy, and if a student is coming with something traumatic, to understand that these inflection points in our lives, especially those that relate around changes in identity, loss of a parent, caring for a sick elder, even a sick relative, tend to be the ones where, if not well addressed, you will have worsening mental health outcomes. In terms of what there is to educate ourselves, Mika, I like the nature of your question, because I think you're doing exactly the first part, which is to ask, what is it that I need to know and what is new? So we know there's been a lot of evolution in brain science. We just frankly know a lot more about, you know, this wonderful engine that drives us half of the time, you know, our heart hopefully drives us. So educating ourselves, there are a lot of podcasts that have come up, some of them, you know, more scientific than others. Even shows like Hidden Brains have enabled us to think about the fact that some of our patterns may be automatic, and to better understand them. So I would say educating ourselves definitely is one. And then the last one, then Antonio, I'd be curious to see how you think, and this is actually related to research that you've done in organization, is learning more about attachment patterns. So attachment patterns are basically patterns of behavior that we develop that are related to our first caregiver. So this caregiver could be a biological parent, it could be a nanny, it could be a grandparent, it could be whomever is in your life at that moment. And then we sort of figure out, can we trust or not? How do we behave? Will this person be there when we need it? What do we need to do to get their attention? And then when we fast forward 40 years later and you start reading about attachment, you see how these behaviors might present in the business world, and I think also in the classroom. And there again, it's not about going up to somebody and say, I think you're anxious avoidant. It's reading up and saying, when a person is anxious avoidant, this is a better way to formulate an email or write to this individual. So those will be very rapidly some top of mind suggestions. Antonio, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, beautifully said, Karen. I don't want to take a lot of time because I agree with pretty much all of the elements that you've said. I think it would be important to emphasize the element that you've mentioned last, the attachment element in the classroom. So educators serve this specific role of instilling a certain level of high standards, especially in the world of academics. And it's difficult to open up the floor for vulnerability, to showcase a little bit of weaknesses. I'm struggling with something, I did something wrong. So there's a best practice here, usually recommended for managers who want to instill a sense of psychological safety in teams, and that's sharing a personal story of failure, because that makes the educator a little less ideal, a little less of a hero, and more of a human. Which could help people open up and form these attachment to a certain degree, of course, certain attachment levels. And then it's up to the educator to maintain a certain level of the psychological safety. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's an enforcement endeavor, but there is a certain level of, I would say, being a sentinel, making sure that the students who are able to open up don't get bullied, or don't get attacked if they open up or share about something that they're struggling with, because we do have a certain tendency to live in these I would say emotionally avoidant cultures and settings where it's not okay to talk about feelings. You have to do your work, as Karen mentioned. You've got 3 days for bereavement, and then I want you here in the office doing all of the workload that's been accumulated. So I would say it's a delicate role of balancing how much is it okay for students to open up without being their therapist, without going into too much detail, but still maintaining a certain level of openness for conversation. So it's a delicate role to balance. Yeah.
I think an opportunity for students also is to have people remind students and employees that we create toxic workplaces too. So I think it's become quite easy to say, mental health at work is a manager issue. It's not a manager issue. It is a manager and employee issue. And so the way that you're presenting in class, the way that you're behaving towards being disrespectful when somebody is speaking and not listening, not giving the person the gift of sort of attention, these are all the students are role modeling in some ways behaviors that they regret in others. So I think reminding students that we all have a responsibility in the co-creation of learning spaces and hopeful places can also maybe feel empowering to them.